Hello, I'm Eric Snodgrass, and thank you for watching this Thursday night, June 8th in-depth ag forecast brought to you by Nutrien Ag Solutions. When you look back over the last 2 weeks at the precipitation as a percent of normal, we can see just this gradual increase in the coverage of showers and storms the farther to the west you get until you get up to the front slope of the Rocky Mountains here. And again, a lot of this was driven by a large high-pressure cell that sat here initially that has slowly with time made its way to the east. Now that flow around that high-pressure cell was coming just like this. So the storms were being initialized out of an easterly wind, and then as you just got more and more upslope, there was more organization, better lifting, and some places in throughout this area we've talked about have had 600 to 1200% of normal precipitation and a tremendous amount of flooding. Meanwhile, while all of that's gone on, the Great Lakes Basin into New England has been extremely dry. Much of the Mississippi Valley, Ohio Valley, Tennessee Valley, the whole thing has been relatively dry as well. We've been very dry in the Pacific Northwest and throughout California, but this is a bit more common. It's only been over the last couple of days that we've had these pesky cutoff lows that have come through that have been driving a lot of the shower and thunderstorm activity into California. So recently, just the last few days, it's been quite a bit wetter here. Now, yesterday I was in Minneapolis talking with a group that was brought there by Bayer, and it was interesting. One of the groups I was talking with says, what are the chances we can just get a hurricane to come right up the gut of the Mississippi and just dump a bunch of rain in this area? And I want to show you something that I think is kind of interesting. If you saw my video this morning, I talked about how the GFS model continues out there around the solstice to make some big hurricane in the Gulf of Mexico. And I mentioned that this is common, that the GFS during June and July and even into August does that. The farther out you go in the forecast run, especially past about day 11 and 12, it almost always blows some big tropical system up. And but we have to just be careful to know that it's maybe a bit of a feedback in the model. But I was a bit curious to see this. So this is today's 12Z run, and there would be this potential, but more than likely non-existent tropical system. In fact, much more likely. I'm going to be very clear on that. Very unlikely non-event here. But if you go back, that's the 12Z run. Here was the 6Z run. It produced it and took it to Florida. This would be the run before that, the 0Z run. There it was. You go back before that to the 18Z run, and it had it here. And in fact, if you go back to the 12Z run, it had it in there as well. So what's interesting is that even though each new model run continues to try to produce this thing somewhere into the Gulf of Mexico, there's no ensemble support for it in both the European model or the GFS ensembles. So it seems to be just a phantom rogue storm being produced, but it is at least something that everybody wants if it does come up and make the turn. Again, highly unlikely, but given how very, very dry we've been into this area, any moisture coming from any system would be beneficial at this point. So again, here's the latest update. This again goes from the 10th of May through the beginning of the day today, and just shows you where things kind of sit. So we can really pick out those drier corridors, here in the Pacific Northwest and also throughout the Great Lakes Basin, the whole area. Now, it is not a rare thing for an early season tropical system to do this. And I only have to rewind the clock a few years back to 2018, where at the end of May, Tropical Storm Alberto came through, and its track delivered a large area here in parts of Illinois, Wisconsin, getting into Michigan, Indiana, Ohio, then down into Kentucky, Tennessee, and of course down farther to the south, where there was well over an inch of rainfall that came on a slow-moving system, not thunderstorm-driven, just rain coming out of a big leftover tropical cyclone. So I wanted to let you know that it's that time of year where we have to pay attention to these things. I just want to be very clear, I am not saying that this is going to happen. Are we clear on that? Just looking at the model runs, it's always way out there in the distant future with the model. But you do need to remember that right now, the ocean temperatures in the main development region, which is here, the Caribbean, the Gulf of Mexico, and then extending into the North Atlantic, are very, very warm. And those very warm ocean temperatures, when this tropical cyclone season does get going, are going to be critical. Now, we have cold water that's off the west coast, but I'm going to make the point to tell you that even though this gives you a negative PDO signal, the atmosphere is not behaving as if there's a negative PDO. We've talked about this the last 2 weeks. It's that shifted Bermuda high that's causing the issues in this pattern. The next thing is El Nino just continues to develop and get stronger and stronger and stronger. And one of the interesting things that was released here in this week with our new long-range model forecasts is this. I'm zooming in here on the Atlantic Ocean, and I'm showing you the latest long-range outlook from the European model for the combined July, August, and September precipitation anomalies. Now, you can see the eastern half of the United States, but I want you to focus in on this. The model has really been quite aggressive at, even though it is not capable, these long-range simulations are not capable of spinning up hurricanes in the simulation, it has adjusted its pressure pattern to likely include a southward shifted Bermuda high. And as a result of that, it is trying to bring in just better flow into this area, which would increase the likelihood that should something develop, it will get pushed over the Lesser Antilles, the Greater Antilles, the Bahamas, and toward the southeast coast. Now, that does not say much about what could come out of the Gulf of Mexico at any given time, but I'm just keeping an eye on this because it wasn't only the long-range update from the European model that saw this, it was also the long-range update from the NMME. Now, here's a global view of this. So we see here in the new data from the National Multi-Model Ensemble that same corridor. Now, the precipitation pattern that you see going across the Pacific, this is very characteristic of an El Nino. And so is this. You see, at the same time we're watching this El Nino develop, all right, where we get these westerly wind bursts here, we get stronger easterly wind bursts in this area, meaning where I'm going to draw this circle is where we tend to have a lot of sinking motion in the atmosphere. And that's made this whole region in through here drier because the air rises on this side, comes back down and sinks over here. So we get some motion kind of like this, if that kind of makes sense if I drew that in the vertical there. But I want to zoom in, and show you the newest update from the NMME for July, August, and September for the United States. Again, it's got a pretty similar setup as the European model. A weak southwest monsoon, largely because there's no massive ridge sitting here. And if there's a drier region, the model was initialized dry, but it's kind of picking up on this corridor. Meaning, again, you've seen me draw this several times. It would appear that there's going to be a corridor in through here of a lot of activity. I believe that the Pacific Northwest starts to go over hotter. I believe it goes over drier. Not parts of Idaho and Montana, but the coast. I don't think California is going to see a whole lot of extreme heat, like super long duration high heat episodes out of this. And I'm going to be watching carefully for when this hurricane season begins to ramp up for what comes over this area. So I just wanted to provide you with some kind of new thoughts here when combining these longer range forecasts. Now, I want to also show you for the NMME the probability side of this. So the probability, these are in percentages, of staying drier here are pretty consistent. Wetter in the corridor identified, higher. But notice the Great Lakes region where we were worried about the dryness continuing, there's not really a strong bias in the model to say that's going to happen. And what we're waiting on is when are we going to finally see the effects of this El Nino, which has now officially been declared by NOAA to have been having a grip on the pattern, or some grip on the pattern, since the beginning of May. Their newest long-range outlook, I mean, just look at this. From May, June, July of this year, all the way to January, February, March of this winter and next year, they've got better than 90% chance of El Nino hanging around. In fact, the highest I saw here, 96% chance going through this upcoming fall. Now, normally if we talk about El Nino, we talk about a reduced hurricane threat, but not in this case. I think the ocean temperatures are too warm, which means when the shear backs off, things are going to get going. Now, I want to show you what this particular El Nino is up to. And this first animation here just plays out through the beginning of June, but it's going to start over here in a moment and go all the way back. In fact, let's force it to restart here. There it is. Back into April. This is depth in the ocean, so down to 450 meters, South American side, Indonesia side. My point is that if you watch this right in through here, there is still a lot of warm water that still has to surface, which means you're going to continue to see these sea surface temperatures climb. We talked about it in Monday's video, the potential for 2 degrees C above average. That's here. That is certainly a possibility as this begins to surface. We've got other indicators that El Nino is happening and got a grip on the trade winds because the Southern Oscillation Index, which we just need it to be below -7 to be considered to be consistently behaving in an El Nino fashion. Well, since May the 10th, it has now dropped down here to almost -20 when you look at the 30-day moving average. That's an indicator of it. Another indicator is this. Even though here over the little while we're going to see this shift in the MJO, do you see the reds that are showing up here? This is stronger westerly wind bursts. And these are the easterly wind bursts here. Remember, I just drew that for you a moment ago. There's a lot of subsidence that's going to be occurring here, and an MJO reset back to the Indian Ocean would be fantastic. That's what we want to see happen. So let me explain to you why I want that to happen. There's a lot of places in drought, and I want that drought to be reversed. I want to start to see the change in that. So if you look here at the latest update from the European model, it's going to sweep over the Indian Ocean now, sweep out over Indonesia, but there are not strong indications that it jumps right back out into the Western Pacific. We do not want it here, okay? We don't want it in phases 7 or 8 specifically. And research would tell you, if you look at some of the peer-reviewed publications, that more than 40% of the time, the MJO doesn't ever get past 4 and 5 before it collapses. And what we would want to watch happen is for it to collapse here and pop back out into phase 1 or phase 2. Watch for that very carefully. And here's the reason why. Let's say the MJO in the month of June comes back out into phase 8. Well, if it comes out into phase 8, we toss these deep troughs into the west. We don't want deep troughs in the west right now. We actually need to be bringing heat back into the west. And so to get troughs there means it's unsettled, there's rain, and for some of the crops that are grown in the west, rain is not good for the crop. Then you have this almost omega look to the pattern. See it? And that omega look means dryness where there already is dryness. The storms just stay lined up on the Rocky Mountains, and that would be where they've been. But we'd get drier in the Canadian Prairie, the Great Lakes Basin, and it'd be cool in the southeast, and all of the unsettled weather would be offshore. That's what a phase 8 MJO would do when we have an El Nino. What we want to see is we want to see it get back over there into phase 1 or phase 2. So the jet has to go over a ridge. That means a bit more heat through the west. And then you see where this trough is located? Fast flow has to go in between that. That's the northwest flow we're talking about. And MJO phase 2 is very common when El Nino has a grip on the pattern. This is the pattern we have to be watching out for. Now, thinking about that, I want to show you a couple other things about El Ninos. Should this El Nino really start to ramp up in its influence later in this month of June and into July, this map shows you the correlation with precipitation rate. In other words, that corridor in through there tends to be significantly wetter when there is an El Nino event going. From there, I want to show you next what the height pattern would do in June and July. We would bunch things up into a bit of a ridge here. Instead of having a big omega block, the pattern would come around this trough in this direction, and the flow gets pushed quickly through here. That's the northwest flow. You tend to get this almost high over low setup here, but what that does is that drives a part of the subtropical branch up and around over ridging that happens over the south. The net effect of this is that you get the Pacific and the North American pattern lining up to deliver northwest flow in the jet stream, but pump moisture in underneath this, which gives that northwest flow something to run into to initiate storms. The other part about it is, no longer do we see, if El Nino takes over, the risk for the subtropical high, called Bermuda high, to live here. It tends to actually be stronger and farther to the south, and that would be the moisture pump we would need. What this also does, though, is it gets those tropical systems to come through here when the shear is lower and increases the threat of those storms. That's what happens if this El Nino really begins to take over. But we could make an argument that lately we've not had that. If you go back just the beginning of this month, where was our Bermuda high? It was there. We had low pressure here. That's the opposite of what happens when El Nino is really fully in control. We had a massive ridge here. We normally would get troughs in this area if El Nino was in control. And what this ended up giving us is this almost omega look to the pattern like that, which only lately has shifted, bringing in that trough that drove all that smoke into the northeastern part of the United States as of late. But that shift is what we got to talk about, because it is moving. Where there was once a big ridge, there's now a trough here and a trough there. So the ridge, where did it go? It's now sitting there. That's a different position. We see the momentum in the jet coming out. We see some sort of subtropical ridging here and the Bermuda high beginning to surface itself. So the flow pops out. And it's going to be the flow popping out over that ridge that is going to give rise to the risk of severe storms later this weekend right down here in the southern plains. What is good about this pattern is that it is shifting toward a direction that is going to be removing the dry risks in places that have been very dry and start to get this pattern kicked into gear. And I want to make a case for that. In the meantime, the ridge going back to Western Canada is not good. I was just watching the satellite imagery today. This is sunrise going forward. So this is smoke from yesterday's fires as they kind of reach a peak in the afternoon. And I'm recording this, mid to late afternoon for the Pacific Northwest, getting into, British Columbia and Alberta, and the fires are just going again here. So the dryness, the heat, it's all back in place, and this is just really exacerbating the problem here for the Western Canada wildfires. So it started off here back in May, went to Eastern Canada late May, early June, and is now back here as we go through the middle part of June. All right, where's that smoke going to go? This is just a quick look at the next 22 hours of the forecast. We're still wrapping up smoke here. This is from the fires in Quebec, but the new forest fires raging here are tracing out the position of this front that we're going to keep a close eye on right there, okay? So more on that in a second. In June and July, the last thing I want to show you here is this. The pattern when we have an El Nino would also represent greater heat here, high over low flow, northwest flow in this direction, ridging to the south. And do you notice what that does? If we return cooler air here, but keep warmer air to the south, this begins to increase the temperature gradient, and an increase in the temperature gradient means an increase in the flow. So that's that whole story told together right now. So what we'll watch for is the ridge that's over British Columbia to move. It's got to move. We're going to watch for the subtropical jet to get involved. We're going to watch for troughing to form here to drive northwest flow. If all of that happens, all of this concern, about the drought that has developed in this area is going to start to shift a bit. It's going to start to be relieved a bit. And I'll show you this. I forgot to put this in here, but the new drought monitor this morning, which was released, about 7 o'clock, it's continued to show some expansion in this area. But I want to make a point here. The reason why this does not show, such incredible drought, even though there's some places here that haven't measured rain in 30 days, is because the long-term outlook from the drought monitor, remember, it's a cumulative statistic, is not by design to capture flash drought issues. Plus, remember, it was very wet here in April and early May. All right, let's get back to this, go through a forecast, and see where we're going to go forward. The next map I want to show you is this one. Let's go right on into the new long-range models. I'm going to look at week 3 into week 4. So this is the week 3 precipitation anomalies. And you can start to see that there's a corridor here where there's some flecks of green in the European model. It is still hung up on keeping this part of the upper Midwest with a slight dry bias. But this is, again, through July 29th. And if we take this out into week 4, which we're going to stop it out here right about there, you still notice that there's this corridor of wetter conditions, but the risk in the European model is to keep it drier in this area. Now, the European model has not been the better performer as of late, but let's now compare this to the week 3 and week 4 forecast that came out from the CFSV2. So we saw this release yesterday. Notice how the CFSV2 has got a wetter corridor a bit farther to the north. And that's week 3, the 22nd through the 28th. And then for the week leading up to July the 4th, we see it opening up again into this corridor, a little bit drier here. If El Nino has got a grip on this pattern by the end of June, I'm not worried about this being dry. You're going to see storms ripping through this area out of the northwest, and there's going to be a lot of places in the country that are going to see a lot of thunderstorm activity. We're going to make that point again in just a few moments. But as it stands, that's week 3 and week 4 from the new model updates. If we step this back and just say, well, what about the weeks leading up to that? Here's the new update from the CPC on the day 6 through 10 pattern. And I'll show you why the pattern's going to look like this. There we go. But cooler in the southwest, California, cooler throughout the mountains. Ridging begins to show up here. Very wet and unsettled at the beginning of this time period here, but as this ridge develops, storms are going to run over the top of it, just like that. So notice that parts of the Mid-South here, getting over the Tennessee Valley, continue to be forecast wet, and it looks like that all the way out into week 2 as well. Now, this is going to be the interesting shape in the jet stream pattern I will be watching out for. We've now seen this advertised in the models all week long. It actually started last Friday, and this is what it now looks like. Watch the pattern. So what we're seeing here over the next few days, here is the ridge that's moved into Western Canada, the trough that keeps getting cut off over California, and we still have the weaker flow in the middle. That's still there. But as we go through the weekend into early next week, a deep trough develops here. Remember, that's the one that today is sitting right over this area. And we start to get this high over low. It's almost a wave break happening over the west coast. So then as we go out there past Tuesday into Wednesday and Thursday, this is where the contrast begins to set up. Flow coming down, subtropical jet coming over, And this begins to really increase the moisture chances across a broad sector of the country. And then as we go out there past the 15th toward the 16th, 17th, and 18th, the key thing to watch is the development of this ridge. If the flow comes in and does that, there's going to be a lot of thunderstorm activity throughout the midsection of the United States, getting up even into the Great Lakes Basin. So to show you this, let's do a multi-model comparison for week 1 first. All of these are 12Z runs. Here it is from the WPC. All right, so this is an update from this morning. The model trended wetter here and wetter there and wetter into New England. Flood watches are still out for most of Montana going forward, northern Idaho. And so we're going to continue to watch this week for the storms to go in this direction. But this is the newest update from, let's take you back here, the 7-day update from, if I can get it queued up, there it is, from the European model. Now, how did it get there? What we're going to be watching is this front coming down. Remember the one I said traced out by the smoke? Here it is by Saturday morning, getting into Sunday morning. And on Sunday into early Monday, that low is currently forecast to curl up over the eastern side of Lake Michigan, and the front sweeps through the drier parts of Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, and down farther south into this part of the eastern Corn Belt. That's just through Monday. The European model then has a second system that tries to show up by next Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. Can you see where it's adding here? That sweeps right into this area. And what the model's doing is curling up a low in that region. I'll show you that in a few seconds, but let's do a little model comparison. So here's the 12Z forecast from the WPC, the European model, and next is the GFS. Big difference is the GFS, just like this morning, wants to curl up the low on Sunday to Monday on the western side of Lake Michigan, delivering more rain to Wisconsin. And so if we take it out there a week, there's the 3 models compared together. GFS, European, WPC. Okay? I want to show you these individual runs, though, because there's some interesting things happening. So let's start this off Friday morning. The GFS is on the left, the European is on the right. There's the large front that comes down with that system. It's in both models. And as we get here into Sunday, the low curls up right here in the GFS, farther to the west than the European. The whole time, storms just continued it here. And I also don't want to leave out that we are expecting heavy rains to come into parts of northern Washington as well, getting up into this part of British Columbia. So there goes the low curling up on Sunday. And as we go forward, it does, in both models, wraps up over Lake Huron into Ontario and spreads its rain farther to east. This is just Monday I'm rocking back and forth over. Now that passes on through. Now watch what happens after this. Both models kick off right here, a band of storms. Okay, this is coming into Tuesday. Can you see them coming through here? The European model eventually brings them over to South Carolina. So does the GFS a little bit farther north, though. But beyond that, the models don't agree. And the European wants to kick off another shortwave right here, coming over that bigger ridge to develop a low coming out of Kansas and Nebraska, hitting Missouri, southern Iowa, Illinois, Indiana. And the GFS doesn't even have it. Now, these are operational runs. We're out there 200 hours. Of course, they don't look the same, but I wanted to show you what the models are up to, so as we watch these evolve together, we'll get a better view of it. As it stands, though, let's do this. This is the 10-day forecast for precipitation probability greater than an inch. You can compare it to the previous run. This was the 0Z look, and this is the new 12Z. And the 12Z is a bit wetter farther to the north. If we wanted to find those drier areas, this is where the chances of getting less than a ½ inch are highest. So that's primarily here in the upper Midwest, getting into the southern Canadian prairie. But going back to the probability of over 1 inch, take a look at the difference between this and the GFS. The GFS is way more generous on the rainfall across a broader section of the country here. But there's consistent signal overall that there's quite a bit of moisture coming in with this pattern progressing through the middle part of the month of June. Lastly, I want to show you the newest updates here for the week 2 precipitation anomalies from all 3 models. And notice how both of them, the GFS and the European, are now seeing that active pattern showing up here, trying to push into the Great Lakes. I am watching out for this area to go hotter and drier pressing through the rest of June. And that's a tough signal right now for the cotton belt. So we're going to have to watch that very, very carefully. One other thing to point out, we'll cover this again tomorrow morning, is the Storm Prediction Center. If I can slide down here and show you this real quick. Yeah, they're now starting to really expand the area, especially on Friday, getting into Saturday for where the severe weather is going to be. We'll talk about this again tomorrow morning, but I wanted to point that out to you. Also, we'll give you a deeper dive into the temperatures tomorrow, but just take a look at the 15-day forecast for average temperature anomalies as viewed as a 5-day sliding window. So much of the next 10 days, if you are in kind of this corridor, kind of just carve it out here, we're going to see cooler weather. And as we play this forward, watch this. This is what I've been waiting to see. Contrast. And that is what's going to help drive the flow that's going to return better chances for lifting air. Heat's going to come into Texas. It's going to come into the south. In fact, there is a significant risk of high heat down here pressing toward the middle and third week of June. But with that comes this. This is the probability of putting in the atmosphere, by the model, 1.5 inches of liquid. So it's a precipitable water. And as I play this forward, we're just going to do this quickly. What do you notice as we get out here past June 13th, 14th, and 15th? Ready? The ridge builds in Texas. The subtropical high tries to return. And as we talked about on Monday, the pattern begins to open up to transporting more and more moisture that will be fuel for storms going forward. This is what typically happens when there's an El Nino with the moisture. And what you get is, over the top, northwest flow that initiates storms. So we're waiting to see if this is the case, because as we looked earlier, we've watched drought develop here over the last about 40 days. So this will be it. This is what we're going to watch. And I hope you found this interesting and informative. And I look forward to talking again tomorrow. Thanks.